This video will be part 3 of my coverage of George Kelly's personal construct theory for PSY 230 personality theory. I left off last time in part 2 hinting at how Kelly construes individual differences and how those differences between people impact their interpersonal interactions. In Kelly's model, individual differences are really related to the very personalized structure of one's personal construct system. So how he applies then this way of defining what individual differences are is by describing them in terms of how each individual understands their social relationships. So there's this really tight interaction in Kelly's model between the individual nature of the personal construct systems and how they interact with actual social relationships. What that means is that individuality, so uniquenesses across people, really comes down to the fact that each individual has his or their own unique construct system. Now, again, Kelly likes to use these sort of mathematical terms, not really mathematical terms, but he likes to put them in this language. You have this construct of individuality. What that means is that everybody has a unique construct system, but then there's also commonality, meaning that because some people live in a world where they have common experiences, common touch points, common culture, common religious experiences, for example, they may have similarities in the way that they build their construct systems. Now, for some people, they're very tightly knit communities, so there may be more commonality than individuality. And other people may have lives and lifestyles that lean in the direction of greater individuality. So there's a high variability there. Sociality, as Kelly defines it, refers to the fact that people become involved with other people. Now, those relationships, those interactions, tend to be more positive. They tend to be perceived to be more positive, and they tend to be perceived to be more productive when the individuals involved are able to understand each other. Now, you can take people who don't have a lot in common, so their commonality with the other individual is low. And that could be, if people are unwilling to take the time to increase their level of understanding, it could lead to great conflict. If, however, even people without a great deal of commonality can come together in such a way that they seek mutual understanding by exploring each other's construct systems, that can lead to more productive outcomes. Now, sociality can be very easy when you already have a great deal of common ground or a great deal of commonality. That means you have more points of common experience. That means that your anticipations of how the other person is going to behave are usually confirmed. Your predictions are often coming true, so you don't feel unpleasant surprises most of the time. If, however, you don't have a lot of that commonality, your social interactions may be a bit more fraught. Now, if you know that you don't have a lot of commonality in your construct systems with another person, but you still want to have a productive outcome, you have to invest the time in getting to know who that person is. So essentially, the practical application of personal construct theory outside of the clinical realm. So the therapist needs to get to know the client by actively exploring the client's individual construct system. In our everyday personal lives, what it may mean is, rather than just assuming that the other person is just like you, you need to actively investigate what their construct system looks like. That way you actually know who they are. You have a better understanding of what their experiences of the world are likely to be and what their experiences of you are likely to be. It also helps you then to tailor your behaviors in such a way that you are better understood by that other person. Kelly also used this idea of transitional constructions to describe growth. So how would Kelly think about personal growth and development? He would describe it in terms of how do we modify and change our constructions or our constructs, our understandings of ourselves and the world. Essentially, constructs change when they're wrong. So if your current set of constructs has been disconfirmed reliably, or if they're disconfirmed but you're open to change, then constructs will be changed. So we are often put in a position where we have to think about either digging our heels in and saying, no, my construct is not wrong, and being resistant to change, or we can say, yeah, that construct's not working for me anymore. My guesses about what was going to happen have been flawed, and I need to change how I'm seeing the world or change how I'm seeing myself. That's how growth occurs, is when we are allowing our constructs to be modified based on our experiences. There are a variety of transitional constructs. Anxiety may be experienced when the events that we're experiencing are outside of the range of experiences we've had in the past. So, in other words, as your authors put it, they're outside of the range of your construct system. That's when we feel fear, when we feel anxiety. When what the world is confronting us with is something we just don't have any kind of conceptualization for interpreting, that makes us fearful, that makes us anxious. And a different sort of modification of that is we can feel threatened when, and you might recognize some pretty immediate ways of applying this idea that Kelly is proposing about threat. If we feel like our construct system, especially the aspects of our construct systems that are related to our deeply held values, when they're being chipped away at, when the world is threatening to just completely challenge a basic fundamental part of your core structure, we tend to feel threatened. So for example, let's say that you're a person who has always had a pretty rigid structure for beliefs about gender identity, for example, but now you're faced with the realities of the 2020s, where we have trans people, and there are trans people in our media, there are trans people in our conversations, in our discussions all the time. If you feel like that's a real threat to your value system, you will experience this emotional experience of threat, that you yourself, because your core structure is being challenged, is under threat. Fear, so 1, 2, and 3 here are all related to one another, but they're slightly different. Anxiety is when there's when you're confronted with out of range experiences. Threat is when you think your core values are being challenged. Fear is when there's an imminent incident, an event right now that is going to cause a change in your core structures. So if I go back to the idea of gender identity, maybe you have parents who have a fairly traditionalist sort of set of assumptions about gender identity, and their child comes home from school, middle school maybe, one day and says, you know what, Mom and Dad, I think I'm trans. And Mom and Dad are like, what? And what they may be experiencing, according to Kelly's model, is fear, because right now their core structure about this idea of gender identity is being challenged by a person in their inner sphere. And that means immediately they have to confront that change in their core structure. Another transitional construction is the experience of guilt. And here, where it's something you've done, and it challenges your part of your role structure for understanding who you are. So maybe you see yourself as a loving, caring, empathetic friend, but you find yourself resistant to engaging with a friend who is constantly needing your time and attention. That can, because you are behaving in a way that you, if you were an outside viewer, would perceive to be not empathetic, caring, and loving, but instead you're being selfish, based. Guilt comes from, judgments. So you see yourself as behaving in a way that's maybe selfish, or even angry at this other person for taking up so much of your time. The emotional consequence might be guilt, because you're not living up to what you see as the standard for your own behavior. Aggressiveness as a transitional construction is when, this is using more elaborate language than necessary. As your authors put it, active elaboration of the perceptual field. Basically what that means is you're going to aggressively seek to add experiences that will then challenge your constructs. So let's say you tend to be a person who likes to live within your boundaries. You're not all that adventurous, but maybe you've decided, maybe you're having a life crisis or midlife crisis, and you're like, you know what, I need to do something to push my boundaries a bit. I'm going to try something new. That would be, in Kelly's model, described as taking an aggressive stance to your construct system, saying, this is what's safe. I'm going to stretch. I'm going to go outside of safe. And here's what I anticipate based on my experiences of other things, but I'm going to be aggressively move in the world in such a way that I'm going to have to expand my construct system, maybe add some constructs, and so on. So that's a transitional construction there. Finally, hostility is a possibility. You may, in a hostile and overt way, attempt to put yourself in the world in such a way that you elicit validation. So, I don't know why my mind is going to issues related to gender identity, but let's say, you have your own perceptions and attitudes about, say, trans people competing in high school sports. So right now, you're probably pulling up your own attitude there. Let's say that if you are in a position of, mentally in a position of hostility, you would actively seek out, let's say, social media information that supports your attitude. Or you would call up and have a vent session with your friends who share your attitude. And what you're doing when you're venting like that is experiencing hostility. For Kelly, what that means is you are adding emotional support to your perceptions to help yourself feel like they are in fact the right perceptions. You'll feel hostility when from the outside your constructs are being challenged by contradictory information. If you have a hostile reaction to that contradictory information, Kelly argued what you're attempting to do is to bolster up the walls that support that construct itself. One of what I find most confusing elements of Kelly's theory is something called cycles of experience, or CPC cycles. They refer to a sequence where you are circumspecting, preempting, and then controlling. Now, essentially, again, big words to describe things are really not that complicated. Circumspection is what Kelly means by using your constructs to ask questions. So you're saying of my constructs, if I believe X, what predictions might I make? So if I believe the world is this way, what do I expect from that world? I'm using circumspection. So I'm using my constructs to make propositions or to spin hypotheses. Preemption refers to thinking about very specific kinds of ways in which events could roll out. And with preemption, you're saying, okay, in my circumspection, I'm thinking things might happen this way. What are the preemptive things that might push the event in one direction versus another? So what kind of dimensions may impact or influence the likelihood of my anticipations coming true? And then there's the control issue. So what kind of choices could I make along the way to impact whether or not my anticipations are going to come true? And the choices that we make when we're using our constructs to make choices and interpretations of our experiences, when we're exercising this ability to use circumspection followed by preemption and then exerting control in your system, is you're deciding how to take action. And what that does, for Kelly, he argues, is it allows you to elaborate on your system itself. So, let's take, for example, you have a construct about, I always tell myself, I'm going to have these examples and they're all laid out and then I forget what they are. I should write them down, obviously. But let's say, you're thinking about a career change. A lot of people think about these things. So I could use my construct system and engage in some circumspection, which is use my knowledge of various aspects of different careers that I might pursue, and I use my knowledge in my construct system to help me make some propositions, some guesses, some possible ideas. Then preemption, what are some of the limitations? What are the things that I need to consider as I employ my constructs for different career options for me? What are the kind of dimensions that I need to explore? Then I need to make some choices and think about what would be the ramifications of taking action. Taking action and making the decision to take action requires that I get more information. So I have to elaborate on my construct system in order to deploy those choices. All of this can take place purely inside your head. It doesn't have to be acted on. It doesn't have to actually take place. One of the miracles of the human experience, from Kelly's point of view, is that we can do this kind of stuff all inside our heads. That's being a big brain creature means that you can actively project into the future and engage in what if thinking very actively. And for him, the CPC cycle is the way in which we elaborate on our experiences and start to think through different options and possibilities. And again, this relates to how he saw personal growth. Now, this image is another way of thinking about how CPC cycles work. You have events, and they have outcomes, and then you can reflect on those outcomes. So you can reflect on outcomes, then you integrate those reflections into your construct system. That may mean that it integrates seamlessly because it was all very consistent with what you expected, or it may mean doing some changing, additions, elaborations, deletions, and so on. Then the results of that integration means that you can create new anticipations, new predictions that then can be planned, and you can actually take action. So that's where the control comes in. That creates new events, and the cycle repeats itself around and around. Finally, and this sort of connects again to this idea of how did Kelly think about personal growth and development. He in one of the applications of his theoretical ideas was this idea of the creativity cycle. He saw, understanding creativity is a particular elaboration of this idea of personal constructs. Being creative essentially means that you are intentionally challenging your construct systems. So when your authors talk about loosening constructions, that means you're saying, here's my construct currently for what the world looks like. If I want to be creative, I need to intentionally loosen those constructs and allow movement outside of those constructs. So when you're loosening constructions, that means you're allowing greater permeability. And then after the creative cycle concludes, you tighten it back up again, and do some integration and thinking about where does this fit, where do I think about it. So the creative process for Kelly involves allowing something new to be brought in and introduced into the system. So you have to loosen your current thinking about meaning and your current understandings to allow new information in so that you can use what you already know in novel ways, in new and different ways. And this isn't just about creativity in the artistic sense, it can be just creativity in the problem-solving sense. So you get into, say you have a situation you've never encountered before, and that situation may call for a creative solution, taking advantage of whatever may be around you. So in this current problem-solving situation, the creative cycle would start with you saying, okay, I need to look around at what I have available. So you loosen your constructs and you look at things, and you may have to look at them in a new and different way in order to solve the problem. Then after the problem is solved, you can tighten those constructs back up because you don't need to creatively solve the problem. The problem is solved. You're then closing the cycle again. So you loosen the construct to solve the problem, using things. It could be objects that you use differently in order to solve a problem. Like think about that wobbly table in the restaurant that's driving you a little bit loopy because it won't stop ticking back and forth. And what do? You look around the table and you're like, is there something I can put under one leg? And you use the packets of salt and you stick them under the leg of the table. Problem solved. You can tighten it up your constructs and think about salt as something you put on your food, right? So that's essentially what the creativity cycle means. You loosen the present meaning system so that you can use ideas, things, thoughts in different ways. Then you can tighten it back up again when it's no longer required. So new material is brought in, used in a new way. Sometimes that means, a permanent reincorporation of the idea, because you need to then make sense of it in terms of your entire construct system. So that's what it means, that last bullet point. New material can be brought into a tight structure that isn't particularly loose at the present time, and then it can be subjected to either fitting or not fitting. Once the construct, like what is the use of a salt packet in a restaurant? Normally, if I'm not having to solve an active problem, there's one use. You put it on your food. Or, line the edge of your margarita glass with it. It's for consumption. As long as you don't need a new challenging use of that salt packet, there's no need to loosen your construct system. If, however, you're faced with a novel situation that requires a creative solution, you might start looking at whatever's available to solve that problem, right? And that's how the creative cycle works, according to Kelly. And again, this is another way that he's looking at the possibility of personal change and also the possibility of personal growth. So it's not just problem solving. It can also be, okay, I'm feeling bored and I'm feeling stuck. That then becomes you in your personality saying, I need challenge, I need something new, I'm going to have to loosen up some elements of my own personal construct system related to who I am, and I'm going to push myself. So I'm loosening it and then engaging in something new, something fresh that brings it into the system, and then you have to do some reintegration, some rethinking about who you are based on these new creative experiences, and then you tighten it back down again. And that adds elements to who you are, which is essentially the process of personality growth and development. And that concludes my coverage of Kelly's personal construct theory.